It is a curious thing how death comes to the most ordinary of places. In St. Mary Mead, where roses climb the cottage walls and gossip is served with afternoon tea, one would imagine life to pass as gently as the church bells at dusk. Yet I have always said, beneath the lace curtains and polished silver, shadows linger. They are not loud shadows. They whisper. They wait. And sometimes at a garden fete, with bunting fluttering in the breeze and jam glistening in the sunlight, they decide to step forward. Chapter 1. The garden fête that soured. The late afternoon sun had gilded St. Mary Mead into something out of a postcard, bunting strung across the vicarage lawn, the air perfumed with roses and sponge cakes, the church bell chiming faintly above the chatter of villagers. Children darted between stalls, the raffle tickets rustled, and everyone smiled the smug smile of a village convinced nothing dreadful could possibly happen here. I, Thomas Reed, junior reporter for the St. Mary Gazette, was mostly concerned with whether my camera had enough film. It didn't. Typical. Still, I wandered between stalls, jotting down who had won the marmalade contest and how many sixpences had been raised for the parish roof. At the jam stall, Mrs. Agatha Templeton, wealthy widow, formidable gossip, was arranging jars with a fastidiousness that suggested international diplomacy rather than black currant preserves. "One must look generous when giving to charity," she remarked to Mrs. Calthorpe, the sharp-faced chairwoman of the relief committee. Moments later, a teacup clattered to the grass. Heads turned. Mrs. Templeton staggered, her parasol listing like a wounded mast. "My chest," she gasped, and then she crumpled beside the gooseberry jam. A chorus of shrieks rose. Someone cried, "The heat!" Others shouted for a doctor. It was Miss Marple who moved first, appearing from behind the sponge cake table like a gentle apparition in lilac. "Stand back, please," she said in her soft, bird-like voice. Kneeling with surprising agility, she loosened Mrs. Templeton's collar, pressed 2 fingers to the wrist. "Fetch Dr. Haydock at once, and some cool water." I crouched nearby, notebook ready. Why was I writing instead of helping? Because habit makes monsters of us. Mrs. Templeton's eyes were wide, fixed on nothing. Constable Brooks arrived, red-faced from hurrying. "Clear a space, everyone. Give her air." He knelt, found the broken teacup, half hidden under hydrangea leaves. He lifted it with 2 fingers. "This yours, sir?" he asked me. I shook my head. My camera finally clicked. The cup's rim gleamed oddly, a faint pearly sheen catching the sun. "Soap residue? Or," I swallowed, "something more sinister?" Miss Marple looked up, calm as ever. "No fuss, Constable. Sometimes ladies faint. Sometimes ladies die. The important thing is to know why," I whispered to her. "You think it's not the heat?" Her blue eyes twinkled, though her face remained solemn. "Heat is rarely selective." And Mrs. Templeton was, I fear, the sort of person who attracted enemies like jam attracts wasps. I scribbled furiously. The fête went on in uneasy murmurs, but the mood had soured. The laughter had drained away with the life of Mrs. Agatha Templeton. And though no one dared say it aloud, the word hung between us all like churchyard fog. Murder. Chapter 2. The Will and the Whispers. The morning after the fête, St. Mary Mead buzzed not with mourning, but with murmurs. By the time I trudged down High Street toward the Gazette office, every cottage window seemed alive with twitching curtains and lowered voices. The death of Mrs. Templeton had transformed into the main course of breakfast conversation. At the Crown and Sickle Inn, Lionel Templeton, her only nephew, was already 2 whiskeys deep before noon. I slipped inside, notebook hidden in my jacket pocket. A journalist's trick, pretend you're only there for the ale. "She wouldn't," Lionel shouted, slamming his glass down so hard the froth leapt. "She loved me, doted on me. Changed her blasted will? Rubbish. A lie." The landlord muttered something about Lionel's unpaid tab. The villagers sitting near the hearth pretended to sip, ears sharpened like hounds. I leaned closer. "You're saying she didn't alter it?" Lionel glared at me. "That's what they're whispering, isn't it? That she left everything to that sanctimonious woman, Mrs. Calthorpe, for her wretched charity. Utter nonsense." From behind, a soft voice interrupted. "It isn't nonsense, Lionel. It's fact." Miss Marple, hat neatly pinned, had arrived so quietly I nearly dropped my pen. She adjusted her gloves with mild precision. "I had it from Mr. Ellison, the solicitor. The will was altered a fortnight ago." Lionel's face flushed crimson. "That hag manipulated her." Now, Miss Marple said, almost kindly. "Words spoken in anger do little but echo." Lionel stormed out, muttering curses that made the vicar's wife blanch. Outside, the air felt strangely heavier, as though the cottages themselves leaned closer to eavesdrop. Miss Marple walked with me toward the green. "Money, dear Mr. Reed, is a curious magnet. It attracts both devotion and destruction." I nodded, scribbling. "So Lionel has a motive." "Perhaps," she mused, eyes on her knitting bag. "But motives multiply like weeds. One must distinguish the dandelion from the deadly nightshade." She paused at the gate of her garden, where hollyhocks swayed lazily. A flash of metal caught my eye. Inside her open basket lay rows of straight pins, perfectly aligned in a cushion. The sight made me oddly uneasy, like weapons pretending to be harmless. She noticed my glance and smiled faintly. "Neatness is a habit, Mr. Reed. But neatness is also an illusion. It tells us little of what lies beneath." As I turned to leave, a village boy ran past, breathless. "Sir, they're saying Mrs. Templeton didn't just collapse. She was poisoned." I looked back at Miss Marple. Her lips pressed thin, her eyes calm as a mill pond. "Yes," she said softly. "I rather suspected as much." And in that moment, the village fete no longer seemed like a country diversion, but the prologue to something darker. The whispers had teeth. Chapter 3. Teacups and Tongues. By noon, the rumor had hardened into fact. Dr. Haydock himself confirmed it. Mrs. Templeton had been poisoned with digitalis, a heart medicine in the right dose, a death sentence in the wrong one. I caught him outside his surgery, notebook already in hand. "Doctor, you're certain?" Haydock wiped his brow with a handkerchief, exasperated. "Digitalis, yes, strong traces. Her heart was never weak enough to warrant it. Someone administered it deliberately." He looked around and lowered his voice. "And that's all you'll get for print, Reed. Don't go frightening the village into hysteria. As if hysteria hadn't already unpacked its suitcase in every sitting room by now." That afternoon, I trailed behind Miss Marple at the church hall, where the fate's crockery had been returned. Constable Brooks hovered nearby, scratching his head as he surveyed the mismatched cups and saucers lined up on trestle tables. "Which one was hers, ma'am?" he asked. "Difficult to say," Miss Marple replied, her eyes scanning with disconcerting sharpness. "Fates are such muddled things. Cups borrowed from the vicarage, from the Women's Institute, even the odd chipped one from a neighbor's pantry. By the end, everyone has drunk from everyone else's teacup. But digitalis had to be put somewhere specific," I pressed. Yes, she murmured. And yet, perhaps not in the cup at all. Her gaze fell on the jam stall table, still sticky despite the cleanup. She reached for the silver spoon that had been left behind in the currant jelly jar. Interesting, she said, turning it over. Sticky. On the underside. I frowned. And that means? She replaced it gently. Unknown, for now. But stickiness, Mr. Reed, is the world's way of keeping a secret until you truly need it. Why did I feel as if she were talking less about jam and more about murder? At the far end of the hall, Mrs. Calthorpe, her charity brooch gleaming like a badge of righteousness, spoke briskly with a knot of villagers. We mustn't sensationalize, she declared. It was a tragic death, but the fête raised over 30 pounds. Agatha would have wanted us to celebrate that. Celebrate? Hissed old Mrs. Price Ridley. She was poisoned under your nose. The group scattered into anxious murmurs. I leaned toward Miss Marple. That woman sounds more concerned with the money than the death. People reveal their hearts in the words they choose not to weigh, she said serenely. Later that evening, I stopped at the Crown and Sickle again, where tongues had loosened further than the corks. She was always fussing with her medicine bottles, muttered one villager. No, she had no need of digitalis, corrected another. Didn't Beatrice Vale give her some tincture for nerves? A third piped up. At that name, heads nodded. Beatrice, the charming new music, teacher in her emerald dresses with a laugh that left men dreamy and women bristling. She said it was herbal, the whisper went, but how can one trust these modern remedies? When I returned home that night, my notes a blur of jam, teacups, and digitalis, I found myself pacing my study. Who had slipped the poison? Through the tea? Through the spoon? Through something else entirely? And as the church bell tolled 9 across the darkened fields, I couldn't shake Miss Marple's words. Sometimes, dear, it isn't the cup we should be watching, but the hand that holds the spoon. Chapter 4. The Charmer in Green. The next day's sun shone with that brazen brightness that makes the village look harmless again. White curtains billowing, roses bowing at garden gates. But beneath it, the whispers had curdled into suspicion. Everyone wanted a culprit, and one name began to hum through St. Mary Mead like a persistent wasp. Beatrice Vale. I first saw her properly at the parish hall rehearsal. A row of schoolchildren stumbled through their piano scales, and at the center of it all was Miss Vale herself. Emerald dress swaying, hair pinned just so, her smile both indulgent and knowing. She seemed carved out of the very idea of youthful charm. "Ah, Mr. Reed, the reporter," she greeted me, her voice a lilting contralto. "You've come to catch me making prodigies of these little lambs?" I coughed, pen already poised. Why was I suddenly self-conscious? She had that effect. Something like that. Though I imagine you've heard what people are saying. Her smile faltered just long enough to reveal a crack. That I handed poor Mrs. Templeton poison in a bottle? Absurd. I recommended nothing more than a calming tincture, hawthorn, valerian, perfectly natural. Mrs. Templeton's hands shook dreadfully, and I thought it might ease her. "Did you provide it yourself?" I pressed. "No," she said smoothly. "I sent her to a herbalist in Much Benham. I can give you the address if you'd like." Miss Marple, who had been sitting demurely in a corner as though music lessons were her daily amusement, lifted her eyes at that. "Pretty girls," she murmured almost to herself, "are like fresh paint. People forgive the drips." I scribbled furiously. "Drips?" Outside the hall, the air felt cooler, though perhaps it was only Beatrice's absence. Miss Marple lingered by the hedgerow, her parasol tilted. "Do you think she did it?" I asked. "Think?" she echoed. "Thinking is a trap. One must observe. Did you notice her wrists?" I frowned. "Her wrists?" "Too pale," she said softly. "No gardening, no real housework, which means she has time. And time, Mr. Reed, is a luxury the guilty often require." That evening, at the Crown and Sickle, the gossip reached fever pitch. Beatrice was the last to speak to Agatha. She dotes on appearances, that one. Newcomers never stay innocent long in this village. Lionel Templeton, slumped in his corner, barked. If anyone tricked Aunt Agatha, it was her. With her potions and her airs, he drained another whiskey, his bitterness sourer than the drink. Miss Marple, seated primly with her sherry, leaned toward me. So convenient, isn't it? To point at the brightest paint on the wall and declare it must be covering something ugly. Convenient, but not always correct. I caught her glance, calm, steady, yet glimmering with something sharp. Was she warning me not to be swept away by the village's tide? That night, I dreamed of emerald cloth fluttering against a church bell rope, a hand dainty but determined. When I woke, the vision clung like cobwebs, and I couldn't help thinking, Miss Marple's drips. What if they weren't paint at all, but something darker staining the edges of Beatrice Vale's charm? Chapter 5. Lionel's Bad Debt. The village had already convicted Beatrice Vale over their breakfast porridge, but Miss Marple, ever contrary to popular judgment, kept her counsel. Which is why, when I spotted Lionel Templeton skulking down a back lane that Tuesday evening, I decided to follow. Reporters, like cats, are drawn to shadows. The lane was damp and narrow, with nettles scraping the stone walls. At the far end, beneath a crooked gas lamp, Lionel stood face to face with a thick-set man in a brown trilby. Their voices carried in angry bursts. "You'll get your money," Lionel snarled. The man's reply was low and brutal. "A week, or I take the motor car, and maybe the cottage too." I ducked behind a rain barrel, heart hammering. Debt. Not just a few pounds either, the kind of sum that makes men desperate. Lionel jabbed a finger at the man's chest. "You wouldn't dare." The man smirked. "Wouldn't I? Debtors are forgettable, Mr. Templeton, but repossession leaves a memory." With that, he vanished into the mist, his footsteps fading. Lionel sagged against the wall, muttering curses that tasted of whiskey. He didn't see me slip away. Later that night, I told Miss Marple what I'd witnessed. She was in her sitting room, teacup poised, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "Debt," she repeated thoughtfully. "Ah, yes, blackmail's untidy cousin, or perhaps it was blackmail itself. You couldn't be certain?" I shook my head. Either way, Lionel's drowning. If his aunt really did cut him out of her will, then desperation might grow teeth, she finished softly. Her eyes didn't leave her knitting, but I noticed the yarn was tangled. Had she done that deliberately, or was it her mind working faster than her hands? When I returned to my lodgings, I found something odd. A folded note slipped under my door. No signature, no flourish. Just 6 words scrawled in ink. "Ask about the bell rope." I read it 3 times. The words seemed to quiver in the lamplight. The bell rope? At the vicarage? What possible relevance could that have? The next morning, I sought out Vicar Clement, hoping to make sense of it. He was polishing the brass lectern when I arrived. "Bell rope?" he repeated, blinking. "Well, yes, young Reed. It's been stiff for months, full of dust and moths. Why do you ask? Any chance, Mrs. Templeton? The vicar shook his head. She never set foot near it. But, oh yes, Miss Vale tugged it once last week. A childish lark. She said it reminded her of cathedral bells in her youth. That green thread of my dream flickered back in my mind. When I relayed this to Miss Marple, her expression was unreadable. Moths do love church towers, she said absently, eyes on her teacup. So do secrets. I stared at her. You think the bell rope matters? She smiled, that maddeningly mild smile. I think it matters when someone wants you to think it does. And that night, as the wind rattled the vicarage windows, I lay awake with the note on my bedside table. Its 6 words loomed larger than the bell itself. Ask about the bell rope. And I began to wonder, was someone leading me toward the truth or away from it? Chapter 6. Night at the Vicarage. The vicarage by lamplight has a particular smell. Old hymn books, damp plaster, and the faint tang of brass polish. I found myself there the very next evening, determined to unravel the riddle of that note. The vicar, obliging if somewhat absent-minded, allowed me into the vestry where the fate's crockery had been hastily washed. "Borrowed half the teacups from here, you know," he said, bustling about. "Mrs. Calthorpe insisted we keep things tidy. Heaven forbid mismatched saucers offend anyone." He chuckled nervously, then left me alone among the shadows. The vestry was chill, the air thick with dust. My lantern beam caught the bell rope dangling from the tower, thick and frayed with age. Something about it beckoned, daring me. I tugged. The rope shuddered, sending a shiver down my spine. From above, dust cascaded in a thin shower. And caught in that shower, fluttering down like a condemned leaf, was a scrap of green thread. I froze. Emerald. The very shade of Beatrice Vale's dress. Heart thumping, I tucked the thread into my notebook and climbed the narrow stair a few steps, peering upward into the tower gloom. Moths burst around me, battering at my lantern. Their wings brushed my cheeks like whispers. Behind me, a voice said quietly, "Curiosity is a dangerous habit, Mr. Reed." I spun, nearly dropping the lantern. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, calm as ever, her cardigan neatly buttoned. "Good Lord, you nearly stopped my heart," I gasped. She stepped closer, gazing at the rope. "Moths do love dark corners, but secrets live here too." I showed her the green thread. "Proof," I whispered. "Beatrice. She lied about her alibi, and now this." "Proof?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but the word cut like a needle. "Threads appear where they wish. This could be a moth's prize, a ribbon's remnant, a careless snag. One must not hang a woman by a single thread," I flushed. Why did her rebukes always feel like lessons in school? We left the vestry together, the bell above tolling faintly with the wind. Outside, the village was cloaked in darkness, cottages shuttered, the air thick with unseen eyes. "Tell me, Mr. Reed," she asked suddenly, "why do you think someone urged you to ask about the bell rope?" "To lead me to Beatrice?" I guessed. "Perhaps." Her eyes glimmered in the lantern light. "Or perhaps to keep you from tugging at the right rope elsewhere." That night, lying in my narrow bed, I stared at the scrap of green pinned to my notes. It looked damning, sinister even. And yet, Miss Marple's words gnawed at me. Was I chasing truth or chasing bait? Chapter 7. The False Alibi. By the next morning, St. Mary Mead had all but convicted Beatrice Vale. The whispers were louder than the church bells. Green thread, last to see her, herbal tinctures. Even Constable Brooks muttered, "It fits too neatly, doesn't it?" But Miss Marple only smiled her soft smile. Things that fit too neatly, Constable, are often cut from the wrong cloth. That afternoon I sought out Beatrice herself, determined to press harder. She received me in her parlor, all lace curtains and the faint scent of lavender. She wore, pointedly, I thought, another emerald dress. "I had nothing to do with Mrs. Templeton's death," she insisted, eyes flashing. "During the fête, I was giving Ruth Denby her piano lesson. You may ask her, an hour-long lesson exactly when your presence was unaccounted for?" I asked. "Yes," she replied smoothly. "Ruth will confirm it." And Ruth did. At first, when I found her in the lane near her father's cottage, the shy schoolgirl nodded quickly, twisting the strap of her satchel. Miss Vale gave me a lesson. She was with me the whole time. Her voice shook. It rang too polished, too rehearsed. That evening, fortune intervened in the form of Ruth's father, a blunt man with mud on his boots. Over a pint at the Crown and Sickle, he frowned when I mentioned the piano lesson. "Lesson?" he grunted. "No. Ruth had her dentist appointment that day. We were in Much Benham. She couldn't have been with Miss Vale. I nearly dropped my notebook." "Are you certain?" "Certain as my own name," he said, draining his pint. I cornered Ruth the next morning, my tone sharper than I intended. "Your father says you were at the dentist during the fête. Why did you lie?" Her eyes brimmed with tears. "Miss Vale asked me to. She said Mrs. Templeton was cruel to animals, that she used to starve her cat, that she had birds trapped in cages. She said if people thought Miss Vale was with me, they'd leave her alone. I didn't want anyone to be cruel again." Her small hands clenched. I only did what she asked. When I reported this to Miss Marple, she didn't look surprised. Her needles clicked softly, the rhythm steady as a clock. "So, Beatrice lied," I said. "That proves it, doesn't it?" Miss Marple looked up, her gaze mild but piercing. "It proves, dear Mr. Reed, only that she is frightened. Frightened people lie for many reasons, sometimes to cover guilt, sometimes merely to shield themselves from suspicion. But why would she say Mrs. Templeton was cruel?" I pressed. "Because cruelty, whether real or invented, is a convenient shade to paint upon the dead. They cannot argue against it, and those who listen are only too ready to nod. I left her cottage unsettled, notebook heavy in my pocket. Beatrice Vale was tangled in lies. Yes, but lies are like vines. They grow in many directions. Some choke the truth. Others are planted to disguise the hand of a gardener working elsewhere. And the question now gnawed at me. Was Beatrice Vale the gardener, or merely the vine? Chapter 8. The Second Collapse. The village had just begun to settle into its favorite pastime, suspicion, when fate, or rather the murderer, chose to stir the pot again. It was Thursday afternoon, a charity tea in the parish hall organized naturally by Mrs. Calthorpe. The long tables sagged under the weight of seed cakes, Victoria sponges, and steaming teapots. Villagers filed in, clutching their purses, their tongues sharper than their knives. I sat near the back, notebook poised. Miss Marple sat primly at the front, her hat tipped just so, as if she had been waiting for something. Half an hour into the proceedings, a commotion broke the gentle clink of china. Mrs. Calthorpe herself let out a strangled sound, clutching her throat. Her teacup clattered, rolling across the tablecloth, leaving a wet trail. "Not again!" cried someone. She slumped sideways. Women screamed, men leapt to their feet. Constable Brooks pushed through the crowd, red-faced. "Give her air," he bellowed, though no one moved an inch. Dr. Haydock, summoned hastily from his seat, bent over her. After a tense minute, he straightened. "Not dead," he said grimly. "Fainted, perhaps, but her pulse is weak. And there's something odd about this." He sniffed the abandoned teacup, dipped a fingertip in the liquid, then grimaced. "Not digitalis. Soap, mixed with glycerin, perhaps, enough to mask the taste of bitterness. Not fatal, but enough to confuse the palate." A wave of shocked murmurs swept the hall. "The same as Mrs. Templeton. Another poisoning. Who's safe?" I caught Miss Marple watching, her eyes narrowed. She didn't move to help, nor did she gasp like the others. She simply observed. When I leaned toward her, whispering, "So it's happening again?" she replied softly, "No, Mr. Reed. It is not happening again. It is being rehearsed." I blinked. "Rehearsed?" "Digitalis first, soap next. One fatal, one merely dramatic. The first convinces the village of murder. The second convinces the village that the murderer is still at large. A clever hand rehearses the play, changing the lines but keeping the same stage." She folded her hands in her lap. "Someone wants us to chase shadows, while the truth stands in plain view." Meanwhile, Mrs. Calthorpe was helped upright, pale but conscious. "It was my tea," she croaked. "The taste, it was strange." Constable Brooks pounded the table. "Enough of this. I'll have everyone's cups collected and tested. No one leaves until I say so." The villagers muttered, uneasy. I scribbled down the details, but my pen shook. If the killer could strike once, twice, what was to stop a third? Miss Marple leaned toward me, her voice calm, almost kind. "Do not let yourself be carried by the current, dear boy. Ask not who nearly died today, but who gained the most from not dying." Her words sent a chill through me. When the tea was finally dismissed, and villagers trickled out, whispering frantically, I lingered with Miss Marple at the hall door. "So, what now?" I asked. She glanced back at the tables, the abandoned cups glinting in the waning sunlight. "Now, Mr. Reed," she said, "the murderer has shown us their hand. The trick is to notice which card they did not mean to show." And with that, she walked off down the lane, parasol tapping lightly against the cobblestones, leaving me staring after her with the uneasy realization that the game had just shifted. If the first poisoning was death, and the second only theater, what on earth was waiting for the finale? Chapter 9. Drawing the net. By Saturday, St. Mary Mead was boiling over. Whispers hissed at garden gates, eyes darted at the grocers, and every villager had an absolute certainty about who the killer was. Some named Lionel, others Beatrice. A few even muttered darkly about Ruth's father, simply because he was the sort of man who looked guilty. Miss Marple, however, remained serenely unshaken. Which is why, when she announced there would be a little gathering in the parish hall that evening, I knew something was coming. And I also knew to bring 3 sharpened pencils for my notes. The hall was chilly, shadows long against the timbered beams. A single lamp glowed on the table where Miss Marple sat, knitting needles resting in her lap. Constable Brooks stood nearby, trying to look authoritative, but mostly looking nervous. The suspects gathered like reluctant actors. Lionel Templeton, collar askew, whiskey still on his breath. Beatrice Vale, her emerald dress darker under the lamplight, chin raised defiantly. Mrs. Calthorpe, pale, still milking sympathy from her fainting spell, her charity brooch polished bright. Vicar Clement, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief, muttering about unchristian unpleasantness. Ruth Denby, fidgeting, her eyes darting anywhere but at Miss Vale. I perched on a chair at the back, notebook ready. The atmosphere was so taut it felt as though even the moths in the rafters were holding their breath. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. You must forgive me, everyone. I dislike fuss, but as I told dear Mr. Reed, when people lie, they may rearrange the furniture, but they forget the dust. It is the dust, you see, that betrays them. Her gaze drifted over the group, soft yet piercing. Mrs. Templeton was poisoned, yes. And Mrs. Calthorpe very nearly convinced us the crime was continuing. But in truth, the threads have already been spun. Lionel barked, "Threads? What threads? All I know is Aunt Agatha wouldn't have cut me out of her will unless someone tricked her." Beatrice flared. "And everyone insists I had reason, simply because I suggested a tincture? I'm not the villain here." "Calm yourselves," Miss Marple said sweetly. "The truth does not require noise, only patience." She lifted a folded handkerchief and placed it on the table. Inside lay 3 small items: a sticky silver jam spoon, a teacup rimmed with a pearly sheen, a scrap of green thread. The air in the hall tightened. Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the vicar. "You mentioned, Mr. Clement, that Miss Vale rang the church bell, did you not?" A charming lark. And yet... The vicar flushed crimson. Yes, just a harmless tug." Beatrice stiffened. "Are you saying ringing a bell makes me a murderer?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh no, my dear. Only if one pulls the wrong rope at the right time. A rope meant to draw suspicion, perhaps, rather than bells?" I felt my pulse quicken. Was she about to reveal everything? Here? Now? The suspect shifted uncomfortably. Ruth chewed her lip. Lionel swore under his breath. Mrs. Calthorpe folded her hands, her expression carefully composed. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice dropping to that deceptively gentle register that made spines stiffen. "We have chased cups, ropes, and tinctures. But what we must ask is not who could poison, but who would benefit from poisoning, and then from staging a second collapse. Someone who needed to confuse us, to paint another in shadow, while keeping themselves in the clear." Her gaze lingered, very softly, on Mrs. Calthorpe. The room seemed to freeze. Constable Brooks coughed awkwardly. "Well, are you saying—" Miss Marple raised a hand. "Not yet, Constable. The truth arrives only at the final cup poured." Her needles clicked once, twice, then rested. "Tomorrow, all will be plain." I gripped my notebook, my breath shallow. If this wasn't the revelation, then what storm was she waiting to unleash in the last act? Chapter 10. The last cup poured. The parish hall smelled of damp stone and paraffin, but the air was tighter than any courtroom. Every villager had crowded in, faces pale, whispers sharp. Constable Brooks fussed with his notebook, cheeks pink. At the front table, Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting neatly folded beside her. She looked for all the world like a grandmother about to read a bedtime story. Except no one here would sleep easy after tonight. She began softly. Mrs. Templeton's death was not an accident. We all know that. But what has confused us, what was meant to confuse us, was the second collapse. A rehearsal, a diversion. One fainting spell to make us believe the murderer was still hunting at random, when in fact the game was already played. The crowd rustled. Lionel shifted in his seat. Beatrice's chin trembled with defiance. Ruth hugged herself, and Mrs. Calthorpe sat very straight, hands folded, face solemn. Miss Marple unfolded her handkerchief, laying out the 3 items again. The sticky jam spoon, the teacup with pearly sheen, the scrap of green thread. 7 small things, she said, whispered their truth to me. I ignored them at first, but one must listen to whispers. They often shout the loudest. The 7 clues. The jam spoon. Sticky on the underside. Not carelessness, but concealment. The digitalis was smeared there, disguised beneath currant jelly. When Mrs. Templeton licked her spoon, the poison passed straight to her lips. The pearly sheen on cups. Soap mixed with glycerin. Not poison itself, but a mask. Used later to simulate strangeness of taste, to make us believe the killer struck twice. The green thread from the bell rope. At first it pointed to Miss Vale. Too neat, too bright, but it was not silk from her dress. It was from the altar frontal embroidery, worked by the charity sewing circle. Mrs. Calthorpe's circle, Ruth's false alibi. Miss Vale did lie, yes, but only to shield herself from gossip. Fear, not guilt. Lies born of desperation are poor foundations for murder. Lionel's debt. Loud, glaring motive. Convenient. Too convenient. A smokescreen for the true culprit. The vestry teacup. Shuffle. Only the organizer of the stalls knew which cups came from where. That knowledge belonged not to Beatrice nor Lionel, but to Mrs. Calthorpe. The practice collapse. Mrs. Calthorpe's fainting spell. So nearly convincing. But it was her greatest mistake. No murderer risks their own life. She knew the soap would not kill her, because she put it there herself. The hall was deathly silent. Miss Marple's gaze lifted, steady, unflinching. Mrs. Calthorpe, you poisoned Mrs. Templeton. You smeared the spoon, staged your own fainting to direct suspicion outward, and thought the village would call Beatrice guilty. But dust, my dear, cannot be rearranged. It clings where it clings. For the first time, Mrs. Calthorpe's mask cracked. Her lips tightened, then loosened into a weary curve. Agatha should have left the will as it was, she said hoarsely. She had no right to undo years of work, to strip the charity that fed the hungry. I only balanced the scales. Constable Brooks lurched forward. That's a confession, that is. But Miss Marple's voice cut through, quiet as a blade. You balanced nothing. You murdered a woman who trusted you. No good cause can be built on poison. Brooks took Mrs. Calthorpe's arm. She didn't fight, only sat straighter, her brooch catching the lamplight as though mocking her charity's name. The hall exhaled at once. Gasps, mutters, the scrape of chairs. I scribbled furiously, my pencil nearly breaking. The neatest lady in the village, revealed as its most secret monster. Who could have believed it? Miss Marple gathered her knitting with calm precision. She turned to me, her expression almost apologetic. I missed it too, you know, until the very end. Sometimes one must allow all the noise to pass, before the truth can hum clearly. I swallowed, closing my notebook. So it was never Beatrice. Never Lionel. Only her. Quite so, Miss Marple said. She rose, adjusting her cardigan. Now, Mr. Reed, I think we've all had quite enough excitement. Do have a bun. Without jam, perhaps. The crowd tittered nervously. And just like that, she walked out into the night, her silhouette small but steady against the village green. And I, left with the echoes of the church bell, realized St. Mary Mead would never look harmless to me again. 7 clues. All there. All missed, until Miss Marple tugged the right thread in the final hour.